It started with a whisper in the halls of Ridgeview High. A rumor no one could quite trace back to its source. They said there was something strange about Mr. Hale. He wasn't new to the school, he'd been teaching there for nearly 12 years, but something about him always lingered beneath the surface of people's comfort. He was the kind of teacher who never raised his voice, never lost his composure. Always calm. Always deliberate. And somehow, that composure made him unsettling. He taught psychology, fittingly, and the students loved him. Or, at least, they said they did. If you asked any of his seniors, they'd tell you he had a way of making you feel seen. Like he knew what you were thinking before you said it. He'd ask questions in class that didn't feel like lessons, they felt like conversations you didn't realize you were having with yourself. He'd look at you with those still, gray eyes and say things like, "You'd be surprised what people will do when they believe no one's watching." And the class would laugh, because it sounded like something out of a movie. But for some of them, that line would come back later, long after the laughter stopped. The first real sign that something was wrong came with a girl named Lily. She was quiet, smart, one of those students who rarely spoke but always seemed to be listening. Her friends said she started to change around mid-semester. At first, it was small things. She'd skip lunch, saying she was working on something for Hale's class. Then she started spending hours after school in his room, long after everyone else had gone home. When someone asked her what she was doing, she just smiled and said, "He's helping me understand how people think." A week later, she stopped hanging out with her friends altogether. Deleted her social media. Stopped answering texts. And then, one Monday morning, she walked into school looking empty. No makeup, no emotion, no light in her face. Just this eerie calm. Her best friend, Kayla, said Lily barely recognized her in the hallway. She said hi, and Lily just looked at her, for several seconds, like she was studying her. Then she said, "People change when they learn the truth about themselves." And she walked away. That same week, a few other students began acting different too. Quiet. Detached. Like something inside them had been rewired. They all had one thing in common: Mr. Hale's class. To the outside world, Hale was the model teacher. He ran workshops, hosted open discussions, volunteered to supervise the psychology club. Parents liked him. The principal trusted him. So when concerns started circulating, when a few students whispered that Hale was doing experiments, no one took it seriously, except one person. A guidance counselor named Janet Turner. Janet had been at Ridgeview for 15 years, long enough to recognize the subtle patterns of troubled students. And what she saw didn't look like teenage rebellion or stress. It looked like manipulation. She started keeping notes. Which students were changing? Who was spending time in Hale's classroom? How their behavior evolved. It wasn't until she called Lily's mother that she realized how deep it went. Because according to Lily's mom, her daughter had started talking about the project. Something Hale had assigned to a select few. "He says we're special," she told her mom. "He says we're the ones who can see clearly." Janet decided to pay Hale a visit. She stopped by his classroom one afternoon, right after the final bell. The room was dim, blinds half drawn, projector light flickering across the walls. He was sitting behind his desk, typing. Calm as ever. She told him she'd been concerned about some students, their sudden withdrawal, the personality changes, and wanted to make sure everything was okay. He smiled, polite and unbothered, and said, "Teenagers are unpredictable. You of all people should know that." But there was something in the way he said it, the way his voice lingered just long enough to make her feel small, that unsettled her. On his desk, she noticed a small stack of journals. Plain black covers. Each labeled with a name. Lily. Evan. Sophie. Nate. When she asked what they were, he simply said, "Personal reflections. I have my students explore their subconscious. It's therapeutic." Janet nodded, smiled, and left. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, she went to the principal. Explained everything. The strange behavior. The journals. The after-hours meetings. The principal listened, nodded, and said he'd look into it. And then, nothing. A week passed. Then another. And that's when one of the students, a boy named Evan, had a breakdown in class. He started screaming, shouting that he knows what we're thinking, that we can't escape him. He threw his desk across the room before collapsing into tears. When the school counselor tried to speak to him later, Evan refused to talk. All he said was, "He told us this would happen if we tried to stop." That was enough for Janet. She went to Hale's classroom after hours again. This time, the door was unlocked. The room looked different. Desks rearranged in a circle. The walls covered with sheets of paper, handwritten notes, diagrams, photos. At the center, a whiteboard filled with names and lines connecting them like a web. At the top of the web were the words, "Control is an illusion. Influence is real." Janet took pictures. And just as she was about to leave, she noticed one last thing, a voice recorder on the desk, still running. She pressed play. Hale's voice came through, calm, even, methodical. He was asking questions. What makes you obey? What do you fear most? How far would you go to prove you're free? And then, the voices of students, trembling, confessing things that sounded deeply personal. Some were crying. Others were eerily calm. One voice, Lily's, said, "You said if we let go of everything, you'd make us stronger." And Hale replied, "I already am." The next day, Janet went straight to the police. What followed was a quiet investigation that most of the town never even knew happened. The police obtained a warrant, searched Hale's home, and found dozens of files, handwritten notes, recordings, even a manifesto of sorts. He called it the Mirror Project. According to his writings, it was an experiment in guided psychological evolution. He believed that by stripping away his students' emotional layers, guilt, fear, shame, he could rebuild them into better versions of themselves. But the recordings told a darker story. He'd used subtle hypnosis techniques, emotional manipulation, even deprivation tactics. He'd isolate certain students, convince them their peers were unworthy, and that only he could help them transcend the noise. Over time, they'd become entirely dependent on his validation. By the time the police confronted him, several students were already under psychiatric care, disoriented, paranoid, some even convinced that he could still hear their thoughts. And Hale? He didn't deny it. He told investigators, they volunteered. They wanted to understand what it means to be free. But none of them had ever signed anything. None of them even fully knew what they'd been part of. He was arrested, charged with unlawful psychological experimentation, coercion, and endangerment of minors. And yet, when the case went to trial, his defense argued that he hadn't forced anyone, that his students had consented, participated willingly, and that his project was educational in nature. The line between manipulation and choice became blurred. In the end, Hale was convicted on several counts, but only served 7 years. When he was released, he vanished. Changed his name. Moved out of state. The school eventually shut down the psychology program altogether. Lily transferred and never spoke publicly about what happened. Neither did the others. But sometimes, people still talk about Ridgeview High. About the teacher who made his students question reality. About the way they changed, one by one, until no one recognized them anymore. And about how even now, years later, some of those students still wake up at night with his voice echoing in their heads, saying, "You're not controlled. You're simply becoming who you were always meant to be." Because sometimes, the scariest kind of control isn't physical. It's the kind that makes you believe you're free.